"You're late," Edward snapped, already in his hospital gown. "Sign the consent form now. Surgery's in 15 minutes. He didn't even look at me, just shoved a pen into my hand like I was the help. My hands trembled, but I still signed. I was seconds from giving him my heart, literally, when Daniel burst in, shaking, his voice cracking. "Grandma, don't do it. Dad rigged your meds. He planned this." My knees buckled. My own son had engineered my death just to inherit faster. But Edward didn't know the pen I'd used wasn't just for signing. It was for documenting. And this teacher? She never turns in a final draft without receipts. What happens next will rip his mask off, publicly, and he'll never see it coming. My name is Margaret Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. After my husband Harold's sudden death, I built a life around teaching 4th grade and raising our son Edward alone. The rhythms of those years still echo in my small apartment. Lavender soap by the sink, the morning kettle's whistle, walls lined with faded class photos and academic certificates. My chest throbs with each heartbeat, marking time like an old classroom clock. Edward only calls when he needs something now. His recent conversations carry a strange, rehearsed quality that makes my teacher's instincts prickle. But I've kept every document, receipt, and calendar entry since 1975 in color-coded folders, a habit from decades of lesson planning. Some might call it surrendering, agreeing to his urgent requests. But I learned long ago, promises without gratitude become weapons. But let me start from the beginning. The fluorescent lights at St. Albans Hospital buzzed like angry wasps trapped in glass. I'd come in for what I thought would be a routine checkup, but Dr. Klein's face told a different story before he even opened the folder. You know that moment when you can tell someone's rehearsed bad news? The way they arrange their papers just so, clear their throat one too many times? "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "your latest tests show significant deterioration in heart function." The antiseptic smell burned my nostrils as he outlined terms like progressive failure and limited options. I sat there, smoothing my cardigan, the blue one Harold had given me our last Christmas together, and thought about all the hearts I'd drawn on classroom chalkboards over the years. Such simple shapes for such complicated organs. "Given your age," Dr. Klein continued, "aggressive treatment might not be—" A knock interrupted him. A nurse rushed in, whispering something that made his eyebrows lift. He turned back to me with an odd expression. "Mrs. Whitaker, this is remarkable timing. Your son Edward is actually in our cardiac wing right now. He has a rare condition requiring a transplant, and finding matches has been—" He shuffled through more papers. "Well, given your relation, we should test compatibility immediately." The next hour blurred into blood draws and consent forms. Each time a nurse stepped in with results, Edward's name pinged through on my phone. "How long? When can we schedule? Don't drag feet on this, Mom." I sat alone in Dr. Klein's office later, reading through the donor packet. My teacher's habits kicked in, uncapping my red pen, underlining key phrases about timing requirements, mental capacity assessments, right of revocation. The words swam together: voluntary, irreversible, terminal donation. My signature felt heavy on that final line. The pen, one of those cheap hospital ones, went into my purse more out of habit than intention. Funny how such massive decisions come down to such small motions of the hand. "We'll begin preparations right away," Dr. Klein said when he returned. I gave him my best parent-teacher conference smile, the one that had smoothed over 1,000 difficult conversations. But walking to my car, something cold and tight wrapped around my ribs, like a warning, like a whisper. At home, I found myself in front of Harold's photograph, the one from our last vacation, him grinning on that silly tourist boat. "It's easy to sacrifice," I told his smiling face. "Being appreciated for it? That's the hard part." The hospital called before I could even make dinner. They had an earliest availability slot. The scheduler's voice was bright, efficient, professional, like ordering takeout, not booking the end of someone's life. Remember those old classroom math problems? If train A leaves the station at this speed and train B at that speed, when do they meet? Well, here was a new one. If a mother's heart beats 70 times per minute, how many beats does she have left before she gives it away? The funny thing about being a teacher is how much time you spend preparing others for their futures. But who prepares you for your own? My phone buzzed again. Another text from Edward. Got the call. Perfect timing, right? Perfect timing. I set the phone down next to Harold's picture and watched the evening shadows creep across our frozen smiles. The kettle whistled in the kitchen. Time for my evening tea. But for once, I let it cry. Back on St. Albans pre-op floor, the usual hospital chaos swirled around us. Nurses, speed walking with clipboards, phones chirping at the desk, that endless PA system calling Dr. Someone to wherever. You'd think after 40 years of school nurse visits with students, I'd be used to medical settings. But this felt different. Heavier. Edward gripped my hands like he was afraid I'd float away. His fingers were cold, and not from the hospital air conditioning. "You'll save me, Mom," he said, squeezing tighter. "Just like you always have. I've heard thousands of thank yous in my teaching career, from students, parents, even the occasional administrator. But Edward's gratitude had an edge to it, more victory than relief. It reminded me of students who'd gotten exactly what they wanted, not what they needed. Daniel, my grandson, stood by the window, hands jammed in his pockets. That boy had always worn his feelings on his face, just like his mother before the divorce, and right now his expression was pure storm clouds. Every time I caught his eye, he'd look away, studying the parking lot like it held the secrets of the universe. Dr. Klein cleared his throat, shuffling through yet another stack of papers. "Now, the surgical sequencing is delicate," he explained. "We'll need several rounds of consent, and the timing has to be—" "I've done private research," Edward cut in, releasing my hands to lean forward. "The sooner we do this, the better the odds, right?" Something in Dr. Klein's pause made me reach for my purse, where my old teacher's notebook waited. 30. Years of parent conferences taught me to document everything. "While urgency is a factor," Dr. Klein began carefully, but Edward was already pulling out his phone, showing charts and statistics I couldn't quite see from my angle. "Look, there's a direct correlation between wait times and rejection rates," Edward insisted. "We need the first available slot. You can tell a lot about people by how they handle medical staff. I'd seen parents bully school nurses, demand special treatment, ignore professional advice." Edward's tone had that same entitled edge. The scheduling coordinator appeared with her tablet, and Edward hovered over her shoulder while she checked the surgery calendar. 3 days, she finally announced. "Thursday morning, first slot." The big digital board over the nurse's station blinked, then displayed the schedule in harsh red letters: Whitaker, E, transplant, or 4. 7:30 a.m. My old Mickey Mouse watch, a gift from my first class of third graders, seemed to tick louder. 3 days, 72 hours. I pulled out my pocket calendar, the kind they don't make anymore, with the little golden corners that never bend. My hand barely shook as I wrote it down. "Grandma." Daniel's voice was so quiet I almost missed it. He drifted closer while everyone else focused on the paperwork. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" Those 2 words clicked into place beside other odd moments. His nervous pacing, the way he wouldn't look at his father, how he'd been showing up at my apartment more often lately, asking about old photos and family stories. Back home that evening, I laid out my overnight bag, the kind you pack when you're not sure you'll need it, but can't risk being unprepared. My favorite cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, went in first. Then the basics. Toiletries, slippers, the crossword book I'd been saving. I'd taught long enough to know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep your composure while your world shifts. Like the time Tommy Matthews had a seizure in the middle of story time, and I had to keep 20 first graders calm while waiting for the ambulance. You learn to breathe through the chaos. My phone buzzed. Edward's message glowed in the dim room. Don't be late. 3. Words shouldn't feel that heavy, but they landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through my carefully maintained calm. I smoothed the bedspread, the same one Harold and I had picked out together at Macy's White Sale, back when Edward was still small enough to hide under it playing Ghost, and tried to remember why this had seemed so simple just days ago. The second morning arrived with that peculiar hospital quiet. You know the kind, where even whispers seem to echo. I'd spent enough time in school nurse offices to recognize the rhythm, the squeak of sensible shoes, the rustle of papers, the soft beep of machines counting heartbeats that suddenly seemed very precious. Dr. Klein had arranged a marathon of pre-op tests. Standard protocol, he assured me, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I noticed how he kept glancing at Edward, who hovered nearby with crossed arms and tapping foot. These liability forms, Edward cut in, sliding another stack across the desk. We should handle these now, right? While Mom's feeling strong? You teach long enough, you learn to read between lines. Edward's words said concern, but his tone whispered impatience. Mrs. Whitaker needs time to review, Dr. Klein began. I've highlighted where she needs to sign, Edward interrupted. The pen he offered felt heavy in my hand. Daniel stood by the window again, shoulders tight as a drum. Grandma, he said suddenly, would you like some tea? The cafeteria's still open? I caught the plea in his voice. That sounds lovely. I tucked my reading glasses into my cardigan pocket. Edward, dear, we'll handle the rest when I return. The elevator ride down was silent. Daniel kept watching the floor numbers, then glancing back at the doors like he expected someone to follow. I'd seen that look before, on kids who had something to tell but were afraid of the telling. The cafeteria smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, an aroma that took me right back to late-night parent conferences. We found a corner table, far from the handful of tired staff hunched over their phones. Everything seemed sharper somehow, the fluorescent glare, the cold plastic of the chair, the way Daniel's spoon clinked against his untouched cup. My phone buzzed. Edward, asking if I'd signed everything yet. Then again, Edward, saying he was speaking to billing about expediting processes. A third time, Edward, threatening to file complaints about administrative delays. I pulled out the consent packet, letting my teacher's habits take over. Blue ink for important notes, red for warnings, yellow highlights for review. There, on page 4, a clause caught my eye. Donor maintains right of withdrawal until moment of surgical induction. I circled it carefully, then again for good measure. You can learn a lot from paperwork if you know how to look. Every pamphlet, every form, every hastily printed email, they all told pieces of a story. I slipped each one into a large manila envelope, labeled it with today's date, and tucked it beneath my spare sweater in my bag. Some lessons you learn the hard way. Document everything. I want you to know something, Daniel, I said, watching him startle at my voice. Whatever happens tomorrow, my first duty is to the truth. Always has been. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Words struggled behind his eyes, but none made it past his lips. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the parking structure, turning the afternoon dark before its time. The elevator dinged behind us, making Daniel jump. You spend enough years managing classrooms, you develop a sixth sense for moments before they break. This one felt like the silence before a fire drill, tense, charged, waiting. Remember what I said about documentation? Well, there's another thing you learn from teaching. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones students can't quite bring themselves to tell. You have to wait, give them space, Let the truth find its own way out. I watched Daniel stare into his cold tea, knuckles white around the cup, and thought about all the times I'd sat just like this in my classroom, waiting for a child to find the courage to speak. The storm clouds deepened, casting strange shadows through the cafeteria windows. Another ding from the elevator, another flinch from Daniel. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the waiting. It's knowing exactly what you'll do when the waiting ends. The rain started around 7, tapping against my bedroom window like nature's timekeeper. I was folding my old blue nightgown, the soft cotton one Harold gave me on our last Christmas together, when the sound of the buzzer made me jump. You know that moment when you're grading papers and come across an answer that's about to change everything? That's how I felt watching Daniel through my security camera, his hair plastered to his forehead, shoulders hunched against the weather. "Come. Up, sweetheart," I said into the intercom. My apartment clock ticked steadily in the background while I waited, each sound marking another step toward tomorrow's surgery. When Daniel stepped inside, water dripping onto my welcome mat, I saw something had broken in him. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, even after I wrapped them around a mug of hot tea. "I can't let you do this," he whispered, staring into the steam, not without knowing. I settled into the chair across from him, my mother's rosary beads cool against my palm. "Tell me." "Dad, he planned this. All of it." Daniel's voice cracked. "The timing of your heart problems, the way they got worse so fast, it wasn't natural." The mug nearly slipped from my fingers. "What do you mean, wasn't natural?" "He found this specialist, Dr. Rhodes. They adjusted your medications, scheduled tests when they knew your numbers would be worst." Daniel pulled out his phone, hands still trembling. "I found emails. Dad was celebrating. Said everything was optimized for the donation timeline." My knees went weak. Thank God I was sitting down. The devastation hit like a physical force, thundering through my ribs where my supposedly failing heart kept its steady beat. Remember how it feels when a student you trusted completely gets caught cheating? Multiply that by every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every proud moment I'd stored up about my son. "Show me," I managed to say, teacher mode taking over despite the grief trying to choke me. "What exactly did you find?" "There's more emails, records. I heard him on the phone last week, laughing about how perfectly it was working." Daniel glanced at the door. "But if he knows I told you, he won't know, not yet." I got up, legs steadier than I expected, and found my green planning notebook, the one I'd used for lesson plans all those years. Some habits never die. Start from the beginning. I need details. My pen moved across the paper in the same neat script that had graded thousands of essays. Dr. Rhodes's name, dates of medication changes, names of tests that might have been manipulated. Each fact a brick in a wall between me and tomorrow's surgery. You spend decades in a classroom. You learn that emotional outbursts solve nothing. Focus on the facts, ask the right questions, build your case. But oh, how it hurt. Every remembered kiss on a scraped knee, every proud graduation photo, every time I'd thought my love was being answered with love. It all curdled into something hard and bright and unfamiliar in my chest. "What about the inheritance?" I asked, remembering Edward's recent questions about my will. "Was that part of his plan too?" Daniel nodded miserably. "He has it all mapped out. The house sale, your savings." My phone buzzed, Edward's name lighting up the screen. "Be ready at 6 tomorrow. Everything's set." I stared at those words while grief swallowed the room whole. The rain kept falling, the clock kept ticking, and somewhere in the city, my son was counting the hours until he could trade his mother's heart for a fatter bank account. You want to know the worst part? Even then, some small piece of me wanted to believe we could fix this. That's what teachers do, right? We fix things. We guide lost souls back to the right path. We never give up on a student, no matter how far they've strayed. But this wasn't a classroom. And my son wasn't a lost student looking for guidance. He was a man who had calculated the exact value of his mother's life and found it wanting. The hours crawled by like wounded things. After Daniel's first confession, I sat in Harold's old armchair, the one I could never bring myself to replace, and let memory after memory surface, each one twisting into something darker than before. Remember how proud I'd been, taking that second job at the library, shelving books until my back ached, just so Edward could have those special science camp summers. I'd catch the last bus home, cold and exhausted, but I'd tell myself, this is what good mothers do. Now that sacrifice tasted like ash in my mouth. You know what kept playing in my head? That time Edward was 12, and I had to cancel our beach vacation because the roof started leaking. I'd used every penny of our trip money for repairs, and instead of sulking, he'd hugged me and said, "It's okay, Mom. You always make things right." The memory used to warm me. Now it felt like swallowing glass. Each remembered moment of pride, every instance I'd thought showed his character, transformed into something hollow, like finding out your favorite book was plagiarized all along. I picked up Harold's photo from the side table, my fingers trembling. "You should see what our boy's become," I whispered to that familiar smile. He learned to wear gratitude like a mask, didn't he? Used my love like it was currency in his pocket. The storm outside matched my mood. Thunder, rolling across the city, while lightning sketched white lines between buildings. I let the despair wash through me in waves. 35 years of teaching had taught me something valuable. You can't think clearly until you've felt what you need to feel. Close to midnight, my doorbell rang again. Daniel stood there, clutching a manila envelope and a small flash drive like they were live explosives. I went back to Dad's office after he left for dinner, he said, spreading the contents across my kitchen table. There's a lot. Email screenshots spilled out in neat chronological order. Edward and Dr. Rhodes planning their little optimization campaign. Calendar entries showing how they'd nudged my appointments to times when my readings would be worst. Medical notes with suggestions for hastening eligibility. You spend decades grading papers. You learn how to document everything. I pulled out a fresh notebook, one of those black and white composition books I'd used for attendance records, and started logging it all. File names, dates, who had access to what, when, the same way I'd document a serious academic violation. This one, Daniel pointed to an email thread, his voice rough. This is where they discussed timing the medication changes. I copied down the details, my teacher's handwriting steady even as another wave of hurt rolled through me. Thunder growled outside, fainter now, like nature itself was running out of rage. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, I started a new page. Evidence distribution timeline. Years of organizing parent-teacher conferences had taught me the value of proper scheduling. Who needed to see these documents first? Hospital Ethics Board? Medical Review Board? The police? You're handling this, really? Well, Daniel said, watching me write. I gave him a tired smile. When you've dealt with 30 years of parent complaints and administrative reviews, you learn how to package information properly. Even my voice surprised me with its calm. No one takes action based on emotions alone. They need facts, documentation, a clear chain of evidence. Rain pattered against the windows while I worked, the sound growing softer as dawn crept closer. Car. Tires splashed through puddles on the street below. Early commuters heading to jobs where, hopefully, their loved ones weren't plotting their demise. I'd just finished logging the last file when Daniel touched my arm. Grandma, I'm so sorry. About all of it. Don't be. I patted his hand. You did the right thing. That's all any teacher ever hopes for, that when the moment comes, their student will choose truth over comfort. We sat there in the gray, pre-dawn light, surrounded by paper proof of betrayal, while somewhere across town, my son slept soundly, dreaming of the inheritance that my death would bring him. Morning crept in like a shy student, hesitant, quiet, carrying more weight than it should. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, but old teaching habits die hard. By 6, I was up making oatmeal and washing down aspirin with lukewarm tea. You know how some mornings feel like. You're moving underwater? This wasn't one of those. Everything seemed razor sharp, like someone had turned up the contrast on the world. The spoon clinked against the bowl with startling clarity. The neighbor's cat prowled past my window, each whisker distinct against the gray dawn. Daniel's text arrived at 7:15. Parking lot B, behind the blue pickup. I gathered my files. 30 years of teaching taught me to always have backups of backups, and headed out. The morning air had that clean after-rain smell that usually lifts my spirits. Not today. Today, it just reminded me of all the spring mornings I'd walked Edward to school, holding his little hand, believing I was raising someone who'd grow into his heart. Daniel was already there, pacing between the concrete pillars. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "I found more," he said, pulling out another folder. "Dad's not as careful with financial records as he is with medical ones." My hands didn't shake as I opened it. Maybe I was all out of tremors after last night. The first page was a bank statement from my joint account with Edward, the one I'd opened to help him manage household expenses when he claimed things were tight. "Look at the transfer patterns," Daniel pointed. I did. And there it was, laid out in columns and dates, small amounts at first, then larger ones, all. Moving to accounts I'd never seen. My retirement CDs, the ones Edward had insisted needed reallocation for better returns, had been emptied into shell accounts under his control. "He told me he was broke," I said, more to myself than Daniel. "Said he couldn't afford the specialized treatments without help, while he was buying investment properties through his holding company." Daniel pulled out more statements. 3 in the last year alone. I'd packed lunches for 3 decades to build those savings. Graded papers on weekends for the extra stipend. Kept the thermostat low in winter and wore Harold's old sweaters. All so Edward could have opportunities. My heart did that flutter thing, the one Dr. Klein had warned about, and I forced myself to take slow, measured breaths. Just like I used to tell my nervous students before big tests, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I borrowed Daniel's phone to photograph every statement, making sure the timestamps were clear. Then I opened my composition book and started a new section. Timeline cross-references. Medical emails on the left, financial transfers on the right. The pattern emerged like one of those connect-the-dots pictures kids do. Simple, obvious, devastating. "I need to make a call," I said, pulling out my own phone. The patient advocacy office answered on the second ring. "This is Margaret Whitaker. I'm scheduled for donor surgery today, and I need to speak with someone privately. Yes, this afternoon would be perfect. 3 o'clock? I'll be there." While I was talking, my phone buzzed with a text. Edward had sent a selfie from pre-op, grinning with a thumbs up. "Ready when you are, Mom." I stared at that smile. The same one he'd given me when I'd bought him his first bike, when I'd scraped together college application fees, when I'd signed the donor papers. Below his message, I wrote 3 words in my notebook: motive, means, method. My pen pressed hard enough to leave impressions on the next page. Funny how 3 simple words could sum up such a complete betrayal. But they did. Motive, my savings, my property, my life insurance. Means, a corrupt doctor, manipulated tests, forced timelines. Method, rush the surgery before anyone could. Intervene. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked. I checked my watch, 9:45 a.m. Surgery was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. Now, we make sure the truth arrives before the anesthesia does. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, throwing long shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere above us, hospital machinery hummed and doctors made their rounds, and my son waited in pre-op, believing his plan was perfect. I looked down at my notebook, at the neat rows of dates and dollars that proved just how thoroughly I'd been deceived. My teacher's handwriting hadn't wavered once. You know those moments when time feels like it's playing tricks? When I taught, the clock would race through good lessons and crawl through difficult ones. That afternoon in patient advocacy, it did both. I'd arrived early, of course, old teacher's habit. The office smelled like paper and coffee, with those generic landscape prints that seemed to multiply in every medical building. The coordinator, Ms. Chen, had just settled in with my file when her pager went off. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitaker. Emergency in oncology. Shouldn't be more than 20 minutes. That was an hour ago. Now I sat watching shadows stretch across the carpet while my chest did that squeezing thing again. You'd think after decades of parent-teacher conferences, I'd be better at waiting. But this wasn't about spelling tests or playground incidents. This was my life, trickling away in 15-minute increments. The folder of evidence sat heavy in my lap. I'd organized everything perfectly. Financial records tabbed in blue, medical documents in red, timeline summary clipped to the front. Just like preparing for a district review. But what good was proof if no one saw it in time? My hand drifted to the consent withdrawal form in my purse. One signature and I could walk away. The thought made my throat tight. Would running solve anything? Edward would just find another way, another victim. And Daniel, brave, honest Daniel, would face his father's fury alone. I pulled out Harold's photo, the one I always carried. He was smiling at our kitchen table, coffee cup in hand, Sunday crossword half finished. "What would you do, love?" I whispered. But I knew. Harold had always said, "Truth matters more than comfort." Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking worried. "Still nothing? Emergency upstairs." I tried to smile. "Apparently there are bigger problems than attempted matricide." He didn't laugh. Neither did I, really. "We can't wait forever," he said, dropping into the chair beside me. "Dad's already texting about dinner plans. Says he wants to celebrate our big day." The bitterness in his voice made him sound older than 23. I smoothed the folder's edge, thinking, "Your father always did love an audience for his performances." That's when it hit me. If we couldn't get officials to listen in time, maybe we could get Edward to talk. Really talk. "Daniel, does your phone still have that voice recorder app, the one you used for lectures?" He nodded slowly, then faster as he caught on. And Dad never thinks about technology unless it's making him money. I pulled out my notebook and started drafting. Years of writing classroom policies had taught me something about precise language. The addendum looked official enough. Additional consent provisions requiring Edward's counter-signature on full medical and estate disclosures to ensure complete transparency between donor and recipient. "He'll never agree," Daniel said, reading over my shoulder. "He will if he thinks it's routine paperwork. You know how he is. Won't read anything that isn't a profit statement." The visitor's kiosk had a printer. 2 clean copies, crisp and professional looking, slid into my folder. I tucked my best pen beside them, the one I'd used for final grades, the one that always wrote smooth as silk. Evening was creeping in, turning the atrium windows into mirrors. My reflection looked tired, but steady. The clock above reception showed 6:45 p.m. Less than 24 hours until surgery. My phone buzzed. Edward's message glowed. "Dinner? Celebrate our big day?" I typed back, "Of course, dear. Just finishing some paperwork. Shall we say 7:30? The reply came instantly. "Perfect. That little Italian place by your apartment? My treat." Of course it was his treat. He'd been treating himself to my savings for months. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You don't have to do this alone." "No," I said, packing up. "My things. But I do have to do it right." Ms. Chen finally returned, apologizing profusely. I assured her it was fine, that these things happen, that I'd come back in the morning. The lie felt clean on my tongue. By morning, we'd either have what we needed, or it wouldn't matter anymore. Standing in the elevator, watching the numbers tick down, I remembered something I used to tell my students before important tests. It's not about being perfect. It's about being prepared. Well, I was prepared. The question was, Would Edward be? The hospital cafe smelled like burned coffee and yesterday's soup. Not exactly the Italian restaurant Edward had promised, but he'd changed plans last minute, claiming he needed to check some details for tomorrow. Always managing, always controlling. This is cozy, isn't it? Edward lounged in his chair, jacket draped just so, every inch the successful. Son treating his dear mother to dinner. Almost like our Sunday brunches when you were teaching. Remember those, Mom? I did remember. Back when a teacher's salary meant store-brand cereal and careful budgeting to afford those precious meals together. Now I wondered how many of those brunches he'd spent calculating what else he could get from me. Those were special times, I said, keeping my voice warm. The trick to handling restless students was to stay calm, no matter what storms brewed beneath the surface. Speaking of special, I have something for you. Edward's eyebrows lifted. Mom, you shouldn't have. I'm the one treating you. You certainly are, I thought, but said, just a bit of paperwork, actually. A gift of clarity, you might say. I pulled out the folder and my good pen. So there's no confusion about our intentions. Always the organized one. He chuckled, but his eyes darted to the papers. What's this about? Just an addendum to tomorrow's consent forms, making sure everything's transparent. I smiled the way I used to when presenting parent-teacher conferences. You know how administrators can be, always wanting everything documented. From 2 tables away, Daniel pretended to study his phone while actually checking the recording app. One small nod told me we were ready. Administrators, Edward scoffed, flipping through pages with practiced casualness, always poking their noses where they don't belong. But we managed them pretty well, didn't we? Got everything lined up just right. My heart thumped. The timeline did come together quickly. That's because I know how to work the system. He tapped his temple with the pen. Got to stay ahead of the game. Can't let bureaucracy slow things down when there's an opportunity. An opportunity? I kept my tone curious, encouraging, the same way I'd draw out students who were close to revealing truth. Life's about seizing the moment, Mom. You taught me that. He grinned, scanning another page. When things align perfectly, you have to act. The right doctors, the right timing. It's just good planning. I slid the final page forward, my finger resting on the clause about undue influence. Some might call it more than planning. Some people lack vision. Edward's pen hovered over the signature line. They don't understand that sometimes you have to guide circumstances, make things happen instead of waiting around. The recorder blinked steadily on Daniel's table. Every word was being captured. And you're good at making things happen, I said softly. The best. He preened slightly. Look how smoothly everything's gone. Most people would still be stuck in preliminary testing, but we're ready for surgery tomorrow. That's what I call effective management. A cleaning cart rattled past, and the cafe worker began stacking chairs at empty tables. The clock read 8:45, 15 minutes to closing. Edward gathered the papers, tucking them into his briefcase. I'll finish these in the morning, Mom. Need to review the language carefully. You know, due diligence. He stood and kissed my cheek. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the big day. We've been working toward. We've. The word hung in the air like poison. Of course, dear. I patted his arm. Everything happens right on schedule. That's my organized mom. He shouldered his briefcase. I'll see you bright and early. 7 a.m. sharp, remember? I watched him stride away, confident and untouchable. For now. Daniel slipped into Edward's vacant seat, phone in hand. Got it all. The part about guiding circumstances matches the emails exactly. Yes, I said, gathering my purse. Your father always did love the sound of his own cleverness. Outside, the parking lot lights cast long shadows. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight we had what we needed. Edward's words, in his own voice, revealing exactly who he was. I touched the withdrawal form in my purse. By morning, everyone else would know too. The morning settled over St. Albans like a gray blanket. All muted footsteps and whispered conversations. You know that pre-dawn quiet in hospitals, where everything feels both urgent and suspended? That's exactly how it was when I arrived at 6:45 a.m., my folder tucked safely in my purse. The pre-op area smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens. A monitor somewhere kept up its steady beeping, like a metronome counting down our final act. Through half-drawn curtains, I could see nurses preparing for the day. Shift, their shadows moving efficiently between supply carts and computer stations. Mrs. Whitaker? A young nurse approached with admission papers. We can get started. Actually, I interrupted gently, I'd like to request a private consultation room first. Just need to review some final documents with my son. I smiled the way I used to when asking the principal for extra classroom supplies. It's for his benefit, really. She hesitated, then nodded. Room 204 is open, just down there on the right. I settled into the small room, arranging everything carefully. The addendum sat pristine on the table, my good pen beside it. Daniel had already positioned himself behind the privacy screen with the camera ready. Now we just needed our star performer. Edward breezed in at 7:05, wearing one of those thin hospital gowns that never quite close properly in the back. Mom, why aren't you prepped yet? We're burning daylight. Just one last piece of paperwork, dear. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing beneath my cardigan. To make sure you have proper access to everything after the surgery. More paperwork? He sighed dramatically. The amount of red tape in this place. It's for your protection, I said, sliding the documents forward. Complete transparency about the estate, medical decisions, everything. So, there are no complications later. That caught his attention. Edward's eyes lit up the same way they used to when spotting a new toy in a store window. Well, if it's about access, he dropped into the chair across from me. Take your time reading it, I said, but he was already scrawling his signature across the pages. Please, he scoffed, signing with a flourish. I trust you, Mom. Besides, I didn't come this far to let paperwork slow us. Down now. This far? I prompted, noting Daniel's subtle thumb up behind the screen. Do you know how close those slow-walking doctors came to ruining my perfect timeline? Edward leaned back, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph. If I hadn't stepped in to manage things how? I kept my expression interested, encouraging. Sometimes you need to arrange for the right circumstances. He winked. Like those medication adjustments. Had to find a specialist who understood urgency, who knew how to read between the lines. The regular doctors were too cautious, too worried about proper protocols. He made air quotes around the words. That must have taken careful planning, I said softly. Months of it, but worth every second. Edward gathered up his copy of the signed papers. And now here we are, right on schedule, just like I planned. A knock at the door made. Us both look up. Dr. Klein stood there in his surgical scrubs, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Whitaker, we need to begin prep if we're going to stay on schedule. Of course, I said. I just need a moment to file these documents properly. You understand about documentation, don't you, Doctor? Naturally, he nodded. We can delay a few minutes for proper paperwork. Oh, let her file whatever she needs, Edward said magnanimously, still floating on. His perceived victory. Mom's always been a stickler for organization. It's adorable, really. I gathered my purse and the folder, feeling the weight of Edward's signature and recorded confession inside. Yes, dear, everything in its proper place. At 7:25 a.m., clutching my evidence folder. You know those moments when time seems to move like honey dripping from a spoon? That's how it felt walking down that fluorescent-lit hallway toward patient. Advocacy. Each step echoed against the linoleum, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. Funny how 30 years of teaching had taught me exactly how to document a case. Every paper dated, every source noted, every detail arranged just so. The patient advocate's office had that generic hospital artwork on the walls, soft watercolors of landscapes that were supposed to be soothing. I'd barely settled into a chair when she read the urgency in my expression and reached for her phone. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, punching in numbers with efficient precision. Those 2 minutes stretched like taffy, but I'd learned patience in my years of grading papers late into the night. I arranged my folders on the edge of her desk, each labeled in my neat teacher's hand. Medical records, financial documents, audio evidence. The ethics officer arrived first, still shrugging into his suit jacket. The hospital counsel wasn't far behind, her heels clicking rapidly down the hall. Neither bothered with small talk. They could smell a situation brewing. "Mrs. Whitaker," the counsel said, settling into a chair. "Please start from the beginning." I reached for the recorder first. "I think it's better if you hear it directly from my son." My fingers trembled slightly as I pressed play, but my voice stayed steady. Edward's recorded smugness filled the room, each damning word crystal clear. When his voice faded, I opened the first folder. Here are the emails between my son and Dr. Harrison about optimizing my medication schedule. I slid the papers across the table, each page marked with yellow sticky notes indicating dates and times. You'll notice the timestamps correspond with changes in my cardiac symptoms. The ethics officer's eyebrows rose as he scanned the exchanges. The counsel started taking rapid notes. "And these," I continued, opening the second folder, "are the financial records showing systematic transfers from my accounts to shells under Edward's control." Again, all dates and transactions are highlighted. The counsel picked up her phone before I'd finished speaking. "Get me risk management. Now." She turned to me while waiting for the connection. "Mrs. Whitaker, how long have you been compiling this?" "Since yesterday evening. But I've kept every record, every receipt, every statement for years. Old habit from teaching. You never know when you'll need to prove what really happened." The room filled with quiet urgency. Risk management patched through to administration. Administration reached Dr. Klein. Somewhere in the building, a nurse was paging Edward to remain in pre-op. I could almost feel the ripples spreading through the hospital's hierarchy, like concentric circles in a pond. My knees started shaking then, the kind of tremor that starts deep inside and works its way out. Funny how your body waits until the crisis is passing to remind you it's been through something. I focused on my breathing, the way I used to before facing a new class of students. In, out, simple as that. "We need to validate these signatures and verify the recording chain of custody," the administrator said. Appearing in the doorway, she had that carefully neutral expression I recognized from parent-teacher conferences. "Mrs. Whitaker, if you could wait here while compliance reviews everything?" I nodded, folding my hands in my lap to still their trembling. "Of course. I understand procedure." They left me there with a paper cup of water and my thoughts. I started counting heartbeats, an old trick from when Edward was small and testing my patience. 100, 200, 300. Heavy footsteps in the hallway made me look up. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Remember what I said about time moving like honey? Sometimes it snaps back like a rubber band. Everything was about to speed up considerably. The verification moved faster than a faculty meeting with summer vacation on the horizon. Compliance officers traced every signature, timestamp, and digital marker while I sipped my cooling water. Within 40 minutes, a security team appeared. 2 broad-shouldered men with badges and earpieces who moved like they expected trouble. You know that moment when you're grading tests and find clear evidence of cheating? There's this peculiar mix of disappointment and satisfaction. That's what I felt watching them escort Edward to the large conference room down the hall. His face had that same look my students wore when caught, disbelief that their clever plan had unraveled. The hospital counsel laid out papers like I used to arrange test results, each violation numbered and highlighted. "Medical records tampering," she began, her voice clipped. "Financial fraud. Conspiracy to commit." "This is ridiculous," Edward cut in, trying to sound amused. "Mom and I were just joking around. You're taking everything out of context." I'd heard that excuse countless times in parent conferences. It never worked then, either. A city investigator arrived. Someone had made calls that mattered. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and carried a leather portfolio that screamed authority. The hospital's legal team walked her through the evidence while Edward's protests grew louder, more desperate. "Look at the timestamps," the investigator said, pointing to the email chain. "These aren't jokes, Mr. Whitaker. This is a documented, pattern of deliberate manipulation. Remember that smell of chalk dust and fresh pencil shavings on the first day of school? How clean and full of possibility everything felt. This moment had the opposite sensation, like watching ink spill across a finished assignment, destroying what could never be made right again." Daniel sat beside me, his knuckles white on the chair arms. I covered his hand with mine, feeling the tremors run through him. "You did the right thing," I whispered. The words caught in my throat like eraser bits. "Initial charging documents," the investigator announced, sliding papers across the table. "Fraud and conspiracy to commit medical exploitation. We'll need you to surrender your passport." Edward's face crumpled, then collapsed, like a sandcastle hit by a wave. All that careful plotting, all that smug certainty, gone in the space of an afternoon. I thought it would feel triumphant, watching justice arrive. Instead, my heart ached with a sadness deeper than the betrayal itself. This was my son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to read and tie his shoes and say, "Please." Now he sat there, about to be charged with trying to engineer my death. Phones started buzzing. The story was breaking. Someone in the hospital had tipped off media, and a local news site already had the basics. Prominent businessman accused of manipulating mother's health for inheritance. Edward's business partners were scrambling to distance themselves, releasing statements about shocking allegations and reviewing all associations. The investigator's phone chirped. She checked it and nodded to the security team. "They're ready." A sharp knock at the door made us all look up. A bailiff stood there, flanked by 2 officers. In the corridor behind them, I caught the flash of cameras. Reporters had arrived, hungry for the story of a son's betrayal and a mother's justice. You spend decades building something, a career, a family, a life. You never expect to sit in a sterile conference room, watching it all come apart like poorly graded papers scattered by a careless wind. Daniel squeezed my hand as they led Edward away. Through the glass walls, camera flashes sparked like summer lightning. I thought of all the times I'd photographed Edward's first days of school, his graduations, his proud moments. Now strangers would capture his shame, and tomorrow's headlines would ensure everyone knew exactly what he'd tried to do. The investigator turned to me with forms requiring signatures. My teacher's habits served me well. I read every line, noted every detail, signed my name with the same care I'd once used on report cards. Each stroke of the pen felt like grading a test I'd hoped never to see. 3 days after they led Edward away in handcuffs, I stood in the small cemetery garden where Harold rests. The afternoon sun warmed my shoulders like a familiar hand, and the air smelled of fresh-turned earth and possibility. You know that moment when the school bell rings on the last day and suddenly summer stretches out before you? That's how freedom felt, standing there with a young rosebush cradled in my arms. Daniel knelt beside me, his sleeves rolled up, working the soil near Harold's headstone. We'd chosen the spot carefully. Just enough sun, just enough shade. The kind of place where beauty could take root and grow stronger. "The arraignment's set for next Tuesday," Daniel said quietly, patting the earth smooth. "They're adding charges as they dig deeper into the financial records." I nodded, feeling that familiar ache. Every mother dreams of seeing her child's name in print, but not like this. The morning paper had run another story. Local CEO faces additional fraud counts. Edward's business partners had dissolved their agreements. His social circle had evaporated, and even our longtime neighbors crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. "Let me help with that, Grandma," Daniel said, reaching for the rose bush. Together we settled it into its new home, our hands working in sync to press the roots deep where they could find purchase. The soil was rich and dark, nothing like the bitter taste of betrayal that still lingered. Remember making those paper flowers in art class? How delicate they were, how easily torn. Real flowers are stronger. They push through concrete, survive drought, bloom after frost. That's what I needed now, something hardy enough to weather storms. Daniel poured water around the base while I steadied the soil. Young plant. My hands didn't shake anymore when I thought about what Edward had planned. They'd found evidence that he'd been laying groundwork for months, doctored medical reports, carefully timed adjustments to my medications, financial accounts stripped and hidden. "I've started the paperwork to reverse the account transfers," Daniel said, sitting back on his heels. "The investigator says we can recover most of it." I touched a pale pink bud, still tightly furled. "It was never about the money, sweetheart. It was about the truth." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll testify. Whatever they need. We'll make this right." The sun slipped behind a cloud, then emerged again, like clarity after confusion. I'd spent 30 years in classrooms teaching children that actions have consequences, that honesty matters more than clever schemes. Now my own son was learning that lesson the hard way, through criminal charges and public disgrace. "You didn't just save my life," I told Daniel, brushing soil from my knees as I stood. "You saved something more important, the truth of what love really means." A breeze stirred the rosebush's leaves, and that single bud seemed to lift its face toward the light. I thought of all the springs I'd spent teaching photosynthesis, how plants turn light into life, how they transform what they're given into something new. Daniel secured the last support stake, ensuring the young plant would grow straight and strong. Like truth, I thought, like justice, like love that refuses to be harvested for someone else's gain. Standing there beside Harold's stone, watching sunlight play across the fresh-planted rose, I felt the weight of everything shift and settle. My heart, the one Edward had tried to claim, beat steady and sure. This garden would grow now, not with desperate sacrifice, but with honest care. Simple as that. I patted the last handful of soil smooth around the base of our new planting. That pink bud nodded gently, a promise of blooms to come. Some things, I realized, are sacred: a mother's love, a grandson's courage, the truth that finally sets us free. Looking at that young rose taking root in consecrated ground, I whispered what I'd finally learned. A mother's love is sacred, never a son's currency.